To acknowledge that depending where you are in this country, this is a really heavy week. The numbers associated with the pandemic are really alarming. And I know in my own community, I have 2 young children. We have just been hit really hard with this acknowledgement that we're going through this incredible time in this country, and there's a lot of people suffering. So I just want to take a moment to say, as much as we are in a space of both acknowledging the genocide and the horrors that have happened in this country, what we're trying to do through our role in Love as a Kind of Cure is to do so from a love and joy-filled space. And so we are very much here to celebrate Amber and David and Brit, and the wonderful work that they're doing within their own spaces. I don't want this to come across as tone deaf, because we do understand that there are things happening. And so our hope is that at least for the next 45, 50 minutes, each of us can create space for joy and love, and understand that that is also part of the work that we must do in order to create lasting change. So sorry, Mahojodi, I wasn't supposed to do introductory parts. We can't help ourselves. So I am so excited to just give a very, very brief intro to the folks that we have invited to be part of this conversation. David Heska Wambly Weiden, and I will apologize in advance if I am mispronouncing. Good. A big fan of David. He's a writer. He and I share a little bit of background together because we both were selected as PEN America Writing for Justice Fellows. And so there's that heart's work there that we share. He's a writer. His first novel came out to great acclaim, and he will talk a little bit about that shortly, but I invite all of you to look a little bit into his work. Amber Starks is an activist. We came upon her work on Instagram, where we do a lot of our work, and we just were completely blown away by Amber's words. Amber, she is has created solidarity in a community that celebrates Afro-Indigenous identity. And both Mahojodi and I, as 2 Black women who come from different countries, we know how important it is, even as we speak about erasure, even as we speak about Indigenous rights, to understand that within these communities, further erasure happens, right? And so part of what we're trying to do in these conversations is to create space for that nuance. And so we're like huge fans. Amber, thank you for being here. Brit Reed is a beadwork artist. She is a cook, and she's also a visual artist. And we also came upon her work on Instagram, and it is absolutely gorgeous. I am especially moved by how much time and space Brit spends outside. And through her Instagram, I have gotten to experience nature in a way that I personally in Montclair, New Jersey, don't get to experience very often. But also the lessons that come along with being connected to the land and being connected to ourselves. And so I have such a heart space for Brit as well. And we want to welcome our panelists today to this important conversation about celebrating Native Americans and Indigenous people today, here and now. So we're going to start with David. The first question, the way that we're going to do this is that we're going to ask a question and go around the panel, and then it'll become more relaxed, I think, once everybody's warmed up. So we're going to start with David. The first question for the panelists really has to do with giving us a sense of the work that you have been doing and how your heritage and your Indigenous background has affected or influenced some of the work that you do today. David, you want to start?
Well, sure. Hey, everybody. Hihani Washte, Amachiapi, David Heska Wambly Weiden. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Sichangu Lakota Nation, and it is really my honor to be here today. This is such a wonderful festival and event, and I'm just so grateful and humbled that you would think of me. So thank you. And thank you, everybody, for attending. I'll talk a little bit about my work. I won't talk too long because I want to hear about the work that's being done from Brit and Amber. But I'm a professor of Native American Studies here in Denver. I'm also an attorney. I donate my legal expertise to several Native organizations in the state of Colorado, and I'm a writer. As you so kindly pointed out, my book Winter Counts came out about 3 months ago, and I'll talk a little bit about the book. I'm a graduate, an MFA graduate of the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. And I wanted, in Winter Counts, I wanted to tell a great story, but I also wanted to create a dialogue. I wanted to spark a dialogue about some of the issues that are occurring in Native lands right now. So the book deals with the broken criminal justice system on reservations. If folks aren't aware, we have a terrible problem on many reservations with missing and murdered Indigenous women and men. And we have a problem with something called the Major Crimes Act, which is a law passed by the American government that takes away our sovereignty. It removes our sovereignty and our independence to prosecute crimes in our own way. Only the US government can prosecute felony crimes on reservations, but they are declining to do so about 30 to 40% of the time and are just letting lawbreakers go free. A Native woman has an 80% chance of being sexually assaulted in her lifetime if she lives on a reservation. I find that horrifying. And so I wrote the book to try to bring awareness to this terrible problem of the Major Crimes Act. And I'm happy to tell you that some things are happening. I published an essay in the New York Times in July, and I'm getting calls from lawyers, law professors, policymakers, and I think hopefully that the dialogue is beginning to start about how we can improve quality of life on reservations, but not just the criminal justice system. My book also deals with the problem of the terrible healthcare that we have on reservations, especially my reservation, the Rosebud Indian Reservation. There's also the problem of mass incarceration of American Indians. I deal with that as well. And we also have a problem with the broken juvenile justice system on reservations. So that's a lot in there. The book hopefully is entertaining to read, but I hope that also it gets people talking. So thank you so much for the kind invitation.
It's wonderful having you here. Thank you so much. I highly recommend everybody pick up David's debut novel. Amber, can we hear from you, please? What is your work and how has your heritage influenced it?
Amber THNKSGVG, Ishti Lashti OS, Ishti Lashti Chadi, Ishti Lashti Mvskoke. Hi, everybody. My name is Amber. I'm Black and I'm Native. I'm also Mvskoke. I also am descendant of Shawnee, Yuchi, Quapaw, and Cherokee peoples. And I guess my work, and it's really hard for me to like own like work or activism as a title, because I feel like a lot of what I do is trying to be in community with relatives, with non-Native and Native relatives, to have discourse around Black indigeneity, and not only here on Turtle Island, but globally. A lot of what I do is try to talk about anti-Blackness globally, Afrophobia globally, and how that then plays into like settler colonial projects, how that plays into racial capitalism, and of course, Indigenous sovereignty. So I think a lot of my work online is about having conversations, having really difficult conversations about anti-Blackness, like, and just the intersectionality of Blackness and indigeneity. I think that a lot of my work, or a lot of these conversations, is meant to unify the Black and Native communities, specifically here in the US. But I also am really trying to decenter like the idea that of indigeneity just being here in North America, specifically the US. I like to speak to like global Indigenous sovereignty, and how us in the US have to think more globally, even about how we see ourselves as Indigenous peoples. So I think it's all over the place, but really it centers, you know, like I said, Black liberation, Indigenous sovereignty, really affirming Black indigeneity, and informing people about the fact that Black natives exist. And like we spoke about earlier, how there's erasure within the Indigenous community here on Turtle Island, but then there's a further erasure of Black natives and those of us who identify as Afro-Indigenous. And that includes our relatives who are freedmen, who are the descendants of enslaved peoples of tribes here in the U.S. So I think that, yeah, I'm having uncomfortable conversations, being uncomfortable myself, but realizing that if we want to realize an Indigenous future, a sovereign Indigenous future, a Black liberated future, a post-colonial future, a post-white supremacist future, a post, you know, racial capitalist future, that we have to start having these conversations now. We have to start having authentic, like living that authentic life now, because if we expect this to crumble, but we're not prepared, my fear is that we're going to perpetuate the very same system we're trying to dismantle. So that's my work, my passion, and I do that with Brit as well. We are in we're in community all the time, always talking about these things, you know, in the DMs. And so I'm really grateful to be on this panel with Brit and also with you, David. So thank you for having me.
This is so great. And one thing that I have to tell you, because Mahohodi and I were, when we met this morning, we're talking about how one of the best parts of this festival has been how we reached out to all our guests separately. And then we found out that like everybody's friends. We're like
all related.
We're like, this is so wonderful, because there's something that's so beautiful about, you know, like coming into this space and coming into the work and understanding, right, as like to people who aren't Indigenous, that we are here to listen and to celebrate and be in solidarity and create space. And then to find out that all of you have been kicking it all along. It's kind of awesome too.
But you know, it's interesting because it picks up on something that I love. I hear consistently. Almost all of our guests have used this words that's so beautiful. And I think it's an invitation for all of us to rethink our relations to other people, relative, kin. I hear that consistently. I love it so deeply. It's so much better than solidarity, or what's the hot phrase from the summer?
Allyship.
Allyship. Like, don't be my ally. I want you to be my kin, you know? Brit, we're so excited to have you. What are your thoughts?
Halito Sohajapia Brit Reed, Chatasia Maja Hoponisia. Hi, my name is Brit Reed. Hopefully I'm not breaking up. We got bad communications here at Tulip. Okay, cool. So I am an activist, an artist, as was stated earlier. I'm also a member of the I Collective, which is a collective of cooks and chefs. And one of my collective members will be here on Saturday to talk. I'm also a co-curator of Blindian Country, which I do that with Amber. And a lot of my work centers around basically just like showcasing our community. I was adopted out, which is akin to boarding school, which if people have learned about that, it's a removal of Native children from their families and communities to ensure that they can't come back in an effort to further assimilate us. And so I'm an adoptee, and for that reason too, I'm not enrolled. And so for the legal purposes of this panel, I say that I'm a Choctaw descendant.
So we know that
the true
you broke up a little bit, so I'll just let you know so people don't miss out on like the critical things you're saying with us.
Okay, so I was gonna say, because of my being an adoptee, representation is very important to me, because I've known personally the repercussions of being of Native people being misrepresented and how that impacts Native people personally, especially on adoptees. And so for me, a lot of my work, whether that's in beadwork or whether that's deals in, you know, like visual artists, or like just like learning the history of my own tribe and learning all that. Like I like to go to the root of it. I like to know like what the history is and all the things that go with that. With my beadwork, I like to more recently like showcase like creation stories that we have as Choctaw people in that, and also just like different scenes from here. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. But most recently, like with my visual art, I really like to showcase just like my relations, because being Native is all about like who claims you, who your family is, who is your community. And so I like to showcase the people that I love and who I claim. And a lot of those people happen to be people who oftentimes don't get represented. Those are Two-Spirit people. And those are also Black Native people. They're like my tribe, Choctaw, like we come from the Southeast, and even amongst like Native people and conversations, whether that's like food or art, the Southeast is often underrepresented. So I really like to showcase Southeastern people and our foods as well. And so that's kind of what my work revolves around.
Wonderful. So we want to talk also about the influences, and whether that be other artists or other activists. We want to talk about folks that you would want us to be aware of, and a little homework for all of our participants. Part of what we want to do is to do this work so that it extends beyond this week, and so that each of us is engaging with the Native American community in a meaningful way and Indigenous peoples in a meaningful way. So I'm gonna go back the way we came. So do you, Brit, want to start by talking about who is maybe the influence that you have thought of that you'd like to introduce us to?
Yeah, I'll just go through them quickly because for me, I can't separate them out. So Native-wise, my big influences, again, come from the Southeast. So that's Dustin Matter, who's a Chickasaw artist. He often does these beautiful portraits of current day Southeastern people set in our Mississippian time period, and a lot of times with like Native women who have our traditional tattoos, which is really important because we're in this period of reclaiming our traditional tattoos as Southeastern people, even though it's a little slower going than other tribes. And in that same vein, I also really appreciate Kelly Gonzalez, who actually some of her work here, the black and white is kind of, I guess, in frame. And she also does like a comic book style. She's very influenced by both Cherokee culture, which she's Cherokee, and often incorporates her language, and kind of has like a kind of like comic book style to it. And I really also appreciate, sorry, Amber will probably have to correct me on my Mvskoke here because I'm probably gonna say it wrong, but Hotfaluz Harjo. They have amazing artwork, and I really appreciate both their photography and their illustrated portraits of femmes that also showcase like Southeastern traditional tattoo work. And that's all of my living Native artists that I would recommend. And then as a Black Native, I'd also recommend Kinde Wiley. Walking into a gallery of Kinde Wiley's like artwork, I have never been so proud to be Black. So like if you get a chance to view his work in person, I completely recommend it. But I thought I'd throw that in there as a fellow Black Native.
And we'll also gather the names and send them back for anyone that's scribbling, quickly as we all are. We'll get the correct spelling and everything else back to all of you, and we'll send a roundup after today. Amber, do you want to tell us about your influences?
Absolutely. So I think like Brit, I have three people who I have either helped me along my journey or I find like solidarity in their work. So first, Johnny Daikon, who is a Mvskoke artist, does mostly Mvskoke art that like talks about our culture. Like it's a way of expressing what we do in our culture, and in a lot of ways helped me in my early reconnecting journey to visually see what it looks like to be Mvskoke. And so for me, his work, I have it all in my upstairs room, and it just like reminds me that I'm Mvskoke. And so I'm grateful to him for, in a lot of ways, unknowingly welcoming me home. So Johnny Daikon's really great. Alan Palaz Lopez, who is an Afro-Indigenous poet, thinker, critic, like cultural critic. He is Afro-Indigenous from Mexico, and their pronouns are they. does a lot of work to speak to Afro-Indigeneity globally as well. And I think in a lot of ways critiques the idea also of Latinidad, and speaks to the erasure of Black folks within Latinidad. And their work is really powerful. It's really bold, it's brave, it's direct. There is like no shame in calling out anti-Blackness, and then also just the erasure of Blackness globally. And then as a non-native Black person, I also, Shay Akil McLean, who is a scholar, he is brilliant. I mean, in a lot of ways, just critiquing white supremacy, critiquing the notion that of race through genetics, and just looking at how we have experienced our bodies through the lens, and our biologies through the lens of white supremacy. And so their work is mostly scholarly. His work is mostly scholarly, but it's brilliant. And it really always has me challenging my own ideas around biology and the construct of race as a tool of white supremacy.
I feel like we're gonna need Amber to lead a study group for us.
No, don't ask me to do that. Horrible.
That's awesome. Thank you both. David, what about you? What are your influences?
Well, what a great question. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about some influences. I'm going to focus on mainly folks that are here and now and doing work now, but I'll mention one that is past. I'll start off by mentioning the person that you guys have already mentioned, David Troyer. So I understand that he opened up your festival. So David Troyer, for me, is a role model in so many ways. His book, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, is, I think, the most important book written for Native American culture in the last 100 years. And I have a piece coming out. I interviewed David. He and I know each other. We've known each other for about 10 years. But this book, he reached beyond anything that I had ever expected him to write. It is fantastic. It is superb. It tells Native history the right way. But David, does a lot of different things. He also writes fiction. He writes literary theory and criticism. And so he really, for me, has been the model of mixing art, history, and activism. So I just can't praise The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee enough. And so if any of y'all have not read it yet, run, do not walk, and go get it. So it is fantastic.
David, you're like a nerd after my own heart. I'm like, yeah, books, they should make you run.
What can I tell you? I'm a book nerd. I own that. So I want to talk about one person who's passed because he's not as well known. So Lewis Owens is a very important figure in Native literary history, but he is, in my view, sadly underappreciated. So Lewis Owens, unfortunately, took his own life in the 90s, but he did really important, groundbreaking work in Native genre fiction. So I've argued that he is the greatest Indigenous crime writer. He also did scholarship. He did literary theory. So the writer Lewis Owens, I really believe that he needs to be more celebrated than he is. Moving on to some other writers that I admire, Stephen Graham Jones, if anybody doesn't know Stephen's work. So Stephen is a friend of mine. He lives out here in Colorado. We see each other every so often. He writes Indigenous science fiction, Indigenous horror. The man writes everything. He has like 30 books out. But he's also one of the great guys in the Native Indigenous world. He always extends a hand. He really embodies community, which is so important to us. And so, yes, I see something on the chat. If y'all don't know his book, The Only Good Indians, it is superb. So Stephen Graham Jones is, really just somebody that has really been an influence on me, both in his writing style, but also in the way that he models himself as a member of the Native literary community. I'll mention a couple other folks. I am not trained in visual art the way you guys are, but there is a wonderful artist out here in Colorado called Greg Deal, G-R-E-G-G, Deal, D-E-A-L. And he's got a website at gregdeal.com. He is a Native artist that I think is doing Native visual artist that is doing some really, really groundbreaking work. go to his website. As part of the Writing for Justice Fellowship from PEN America, I was in the first cohort of that, and they gave me a small budget to do an event, and I instead commissioned Greg Deal to create a painting on mass incarceration of Native Americans. And he is just a wonderful artist. And so trust me, if you go to his website, you'll appreciate it. And I'll close by saying that there's an activist that I would like to mention as well. He's not really an artist, but Wiz Gary at Little Elk is on my reservation, and he is doing some really wonderful work to try and help economic development on the Rosebud Indian Reservation. So that is a person that I really admire as well. So thank you for this wonderful question.
Wow, I'm so excited now. I feel like my eyes are gonna be in joy. My reader's heart is gonna be in joy. So thank you all for preparing those recommendations for all of us. We wanted to talk, spend some time talking about the work that lies ahead for all of us. And so part of this next question has to do with how do we go about ensuring that we don't perpetuate erasure and that we don't perpetuate this concept that Native Americans are extinct. And so part of what we really want to think about are both behaviors, actions, whatever each of you would recommend that we should do in order to not do that. So Amber, can you start? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Mahohodi, were you gonna add something?
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in and contextualize that question a little bit more for our audience, because yes, I know that the speakers are extremely well voiced and understand this issue intimately, but I think for non-natives, sometimes there's a lack of connecting the dots of why we believe, as a friend, a native friend put to me, that the new form of racism against Native people is erasure. And if you're paying attention and if you know what some of the signals are, like those little dog whistles, your ears perk up and you're like, wait, it's happening right now. And why is it happening right now in my own community? If you were celebrating, like a lot of us, this historic victory when Kamala Harris won, one of the biggest, media outlets put out word that Black voters supported Biden-Harris ticket by X number, Latinx people supported Biden-Harris ticket by X number. They went the whole way down describing all these different demographics by their names that we recognize them as humans. And then they said, yeah, and then something else. And that something else is a stand-in for Native American people, but it's also the stand-in that tipped the votes, right? So there's so many ways that we drive down a road and it has a Native name, like Lenape, where I am, and you don't recognize that you're driving down somebody else's land. You live on somebody else's land at their mercy. And so that's why we wanted to engage you in this particular question, helping people understand, like, how do we stop participating in this ongoing violence? Anyone?
Yeah. That's amazing. Thank you I think that's really good. So I think that one of the ways we do this is to recognize Indigenous and tribal sovereignty. Like, for me, that's so very important. And to recognize what the two of those things mean. Indigenous people as a group, in the context of here of the Americas, is realizing that we've been here since time immemorial, that our relationship to the land is not as a commodity. We are stewards. We see ourselves as stewards, and that is like a general pan-Indigenous idea, right? Or a pan-Indigenous notion. But then also to remember that there are different peoples who live here and are sovereign nations. And when I speak to sovereignty, I'm speaking to sovereignty in two ways, both in our political sovereignty, how we choose to self-govern, how we choose to our right to self-determination, our histories, our knowledge, our ideas about self, like how we choose to then use that for our self-determination. But I also like to speak to our inherent sovereignty, the idea that no one can give or take away what belongs to us, what we're born with, right? And so acknowledging that as settlers and descendants of, settler colonial project, that this land, even though you might have a title to it, is not owned by you. And we as Native peoples don't see ourselves as necessarily owning the land in a commodified way, but that we're in relationship to the land. We're in relationship to non-human relatives, that we understand that we are in relationship to the ecosystem as a whole, right? And I think that if not understanding that, if not recognizing that Indigenous peoples are inherently sovereign, and that our right to exist in the places of our ancestors in these lands, they've been in these lands for, like I said, since time immemorial. And I think not having an understanding of that, not knowing the land that you currently preside on, like right now I am in Portland, Oregon. So I am on Chinook, Kalapuya, Multnomah, Malala land, and these peoples still exist. And it would be harmful of me as also an Indigenous person, as an Afro-Indigenous person, to not recognize that I am on the land of peoples who are still here. And I think I like to, when I'm speaking in conversation to relatives, I like to remind them that I see them, and not just like physically see them, but see who they are, who their peoples are, where they, who they come from, even if I don't know their histories. So I think we're having mutual respect, understanding that it's important that even I, as a Native person, as an Afro-Indigenous person, have to recognize the sovereignty and, specifically the tribal sovereignty of my relatives. And so I think as non-Native folks, it's really important to start shifting your frame around around your position in this place as a guest, as a visitor, even if it's a lifelong visitor to these places. And I think also, just like I said, I think it's really important to understand and to validate and to acknowledge Indigenous sovereignty and tribal sovereignty, and that you don't get to steal identity. Even if you have a long lost grandmother story, it is your responsibility to reconnect respectfully. It is your responsibility to do that work, to build relationship. And it's important not to just go around saying that you are something that you have no connection to, or that you don't know that you actually have connection to. I think it's really important not to steal Indigenous identity for whatever reason, whether you're, trying to commodify it, whether you're trying to make an excuse for a football team that you love. I just really think it's important that if you are saying you are a people, you need to do that work to reconnect. You need to do that work to learn. You need to do that work to sometimes be silent and listen. So yeah, I think those are the ways that you can respect that Indigenous people are still here. We're still alive. And we are still continuing the ways of our peoples who come before us. We see that as a responsibility. And we also, I think, generally speaking, I can say we see this as a responsibility, and we take pride in our heritages and our cultures. And it's important as non-Native visitors to also respect that, that we still exist.
Yeah, thank you for that. Mahohodi and I started preparing for this festival over the summer. And I remember, I just very recently started practicing land acknowledgement. I mean, I can admit that. And it really makes a big difference once you start practicing this, where you create space. I traveled with my children up north, and I spent some time finding out before I went where we were going, whose land it was on. I spoke to my children about it. And the strangest thing, it's like a spiritual thing that happens to you, because you realize in a very visceral way that there's been a past in the land. I don't know how else to say it. To me, I go on vacation, I'm like, ooh, party all day by the beach. And there's this sense that we're just there to enjoy wherever we are and be in the moment and relax. But there's something really profound that happens. And I just want to call that out, Amber, because I never thought that it would actually be so profound. Like mentally, what happens to you when you start acknowledging that you are a guest. And even in my own home now, I did the same thing with my children, saying, okay, this is where we are. This is who lived here before. So I really think it's this subtle, it feels like a subtle thing to do, to acknowledge who was there, who is still there. But at least for me personally, it really has made a profound difference in my sense of myself in space. So who else wants to go next?
I guess I will. Oh, is it all right if I just say like a little thing, real quick thing? And I can like pass it back to you, Dave. I think that like, well, one, this is like such a large question, right? I feel like there's so many different ways to answer, whether that's through like policy, which I definitely have a lot to say about that, whether that's through, you know, interpersonal connections and relationships and things. But just to quickly respond to the land acknowledgement thing, I right now live on the Tulalip Reservation via like my partner and his family, and I work here. And that's north of Seattle. And I'm very blessed to live in an area where land acknowledgement has been a thing for quite some time. And I think because of living in a place where people have been doing that for far longer than other areas of the country, I think my community, including the Seattle
She'll come back in a minute.
Okay.
We lost you. Can you?
Yeah, sorry. It's one of the struggles of living on a reservation. We just don't have good telecommunications, you know, and COVID's not helping with everyone being home. But I was saying that like living in a place where we have had like land acknowledgement for a long time here in Washington, Native people recognize here that land acknowledgement is not enough. There's this like anecdotal story that someone came up as an analogy saying that, you know, there was a student in a class that had a water bottle on their table and the teacher came by, grabbed the water bottle and then sat down. The student got mad and was like, hey, that's my water bottle. And they're like, I acknowledge this is your water bottle, and then just like moves on. And they're like, yo, I want that back. And it's like, yeah, land acknowledgements are cool, but unless there's action behind that land acknowledgement, it's just like meaningless essentially. And so it is good to learn like who's around you, because Native people are not dead. Like we are everywhere, whether we look the way that you think we should look or not. So we also hear you when you say things, we see you when you say things. But I think that like you were talking about, like it is so enriching to be able to move through this country when you can't travel, to know whose land you're on. Like I feel like I'm moving through like different countries and like there's so many different cultures. Like being here in the Northwest is completely different culturally than being down in the Southeast, or like going out to the Dakotas and being like with the tribes. I'm gonna like hit it back to David and then I'll come back to the question because I want to hear what David has to say as well. But I just wanted to like address the land acknowledgement thing, because I think that's something that people don't talk about as this conversation is coming up more and more across the country.
When we come back to you, Brit, because I would love to hear what David is got to say on the issue. You know, you're raising something that I think is really important for people to grapple with as individuals. So obviously there's things at the policy level, like you pointed out, but what I'm really curious about is, as an individual, as someone who belongs in a community, how do I act on land acknowledgement? What would that mean for me to show up beyond saying, okay, this is, you know, Lenape. How do you move beyond that question? Maybe we can hear from David first and then we can circle back to you. Thank you.
Well, I will actually address that question a little bit, because Brit, you and I are thinking along the same lines. I love land acknowledgements, but I like to couple a land acknowledgement with a call for action. And so anybody, you know, folks that are watching today, you know, if you want to help, we need help right now, especially with COVID. My reservation, we are getting hit bad. The Navajos are getting hit bad. The Rosebud Sioux Tribe is our official legal name. They have a COVID-19 relief button if you go to their website. If you go to my website, davidweiden.com, under book clubs, I've got a resources tab and I've got organizations you can donate to. We need help, but it's not, so in other words, land acknowledgements are important and wonderful, but I think they should be accompanied by a call for action. And one way to increase and help Native sovereignty is to not only give to organizations, donate your time and your dollars if you have them to spare, but also just raise your awareness. And so there's been a lot of talk of sovereignty today. And I just want to point out there are three things that my students that aren't aware of these issues are always stunned by. The boarding schools, my own grandmother was one of those poor souls that was taken to the Carlisle Indian School. And it's not taught in our curriculum right now that 30 to 40% of Native children were taken without consent from their parents and shipped across the country where they were horribly abused. They were not allowed to practice their culture, speak their language. This is a part of American history that should be brought to the forefront. I also find that students are not aware that our spirituality was criminalized until 1978. 1978, it was a felony crime before then to practice our Native spirituality. And my students say, but Dave, what about the First Amendment? And I explain to them that the Constitution has never been applied fairly or equally to Native people. They have erased us and erased our sovereignty. And there's also an important case, speaking about land, Johnson versus McIntosh was one of the first cases dealing with Natives from the US Supreme Court. That case, which is still good law, says that Natives do not have the right to own title to land in the United States. We have the right of occupancy, but we don't have the right of title. The doctrine of discovery says that when a Christian sets foot on land which is occupied by non-Christians, the Christian automatically gains all title to the land. And so that's how they justified the theft of the North American continents, Turtle Island. And that is still good law. It's never been overturned. So I just want to say, raise your awareness of the ways that the US government has systematically erased us and erased our sovereignty. And so, awareness is the first step to change. All right, thank you.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I want to just, I think it's so important what you're saying, David. Thank you for giving us these really tangible things to think about. Those of you that have been part of these conversations, I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about what's happening in the border with Mexico today and how these children are being separated. We just found out within the last several weeks that the number has now ballooned up to nearly 1,000 children that have been separated from their parents, and the parents cannot be found. And so when we talk about history repeating itself, it doesn't take that long, right? When you think about the ways in which these criminal acts happen and continue to happen under our watch, and we become complicit in ways. And so to me, that's part of the reason why it is so important to make sure that these types of actions that have taken place in this country need to be taught. And there's like a huge revitalization happening, especially at the heels of Black Lives Matter this summer, where like people are looking at curriculum, people are recognizing the challenges that exist today in the way that even just the lens through which we look at history, right? And what we choose to celebrate. So I just wanted to like make that connection there, because I think it's an important connection as we continue our anti-racism work. Brit, back to you.
Okay, so like the way I would recommend for individuals to be able to step up and support Native people is, one, learn who's around you. Like I said before, you are constantly surrounded by Native people, even if you're in an urban center, because of the, forgetting my policies now, but in the 1970s, essentially Congress said that Native tribes are no longer going to be Native tribes as a means to be able to grab land, and coupling with that policy, they relocated 70% of the Native population to cities. So around you, there's tons of Native urban cities, and of course in New York City, where some of you are at, has the largest population of Native people. And I can say by having folks that are in the Indigenous Kinship Collective that oftentimes Native people, particularly there, despite being the largest population of urban Native people, never get a seat at the table. And that's pretty unacceptable considering that's the largest population of urban Native people. And so knowing who's around you, also supporting those tribes. There has never been a time in which Native nations have stopped fighting for, for being treated correctly, for our lands, for our relatives. And when we say relatives, we don't simply just mean human beings. We mean the land, the water, the plants, the animals, and even things that like people wouldn't consider to be alive. And so we're constantly fighting for all of those peoples. And so learning what our struggles are, whether that's making sure that the salmon are actually going to be able to survive here on the coast, because I know that's an issue not just here in Washington with the Coast Salish tribes, but also down in California and Oregon. There's also the Micmac up in Canada just had like a very large dispute with the commercial fishermen and lobstermen there that they definitely still need support. There's the Algonquin that are fighting for issues around moose right now, and there's still people up in BC that are fighting against the pipelines. And that's just a couple of the struggles, and there's many around the country. And so many of these are local fights for you. So learn again who those people are around you and what their fights are. And for us, we can't separate out policy from our lives, because policy is so intimately tied in with how we are affected. For example, like in Oklahoma, a lot of people, for whatever reason, it was not national news, but the entire eastern part of Oklahoma became reservations yet again, which was a huge victory on some levels, but also there's continual, the government there is continuing to try and take away the right of tribes to control the environmental policies on our land, which to us is everything. For me, again, it goes back to food. It also goes back to medicine, and it goes back to caring for our lands, because we've continuously in Oklahoma had our water rights taken away time and time again, which we should have there.
Such a good spot.
That into reservation land, and also taking away certain jurisdictional, the right of tribes to take care of the jurisdiction there has also on an intimate level affected my friend, for example, who was sexually assaulted and had her case thrown out because she was a Cherokee citizen and that land had been turned back into reservation. And so there's a lot of issues that are going on there in Oklahoma. So beyond just not culturally appropriating, which would be great, beyond just supporting Native artists and buying directly from Native people, beyond listening, having, as my dad would say, big eyes, big ears, small mouth. So watch and listen, don't talk as much. And listening to Native people and what our stories are, and not appropriating or misrepresenting those stories. Definitely, again, just gonna hammer that one home. Find out who's around you, find out what the issues are, and then support Native people. Because that's really the best thing that you can do.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like I'm gonna start quoting you, Brit. It's like big ears, big eyes, small mouth. And so much of what we are grateful for, the three of you being with us, and also bringing along your histories and your heritage, and your wisdom. We really appreciate that, because there is a time, and Mahojodi and I had talked about it, just like, how do we create this space where we can practice listening and practice learning in a respectful way that doesn't come across as patronizing, right? Because a lot of times, any of us who have been spaces where we are constantly being asked to explain ourselves and educate people, it's exhausting too. So a lot of the work that Mahojodi and I are trying to do is to find a way in which we can do that. We can listen, to become relatives. And I feel like I'm just gonna call you guys my relatives, whether you want to or not, David and Amber and Brit. But it has been such an incredible time. I can't believe that we're already at the top of the hour. I just want to invite each of you to make any closing remarks that you'd like to make. And then I'll give it to my partner in crime to talk to the audience about what we have coming up next. So closing remarks, I'll start with you, David.
I just want to say thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everybody that's listening for taking part in these really important issues. And so it's just been, and thank you guys for setting this up. I think it fulfills a really important and vital purpose. So thank you so much.
Yay. Amber, you wanna, any closing remarks, anything else that you think you wanna keep us in mind?
Yeah, Mado, thank you so much for having me and having, creating community so that we can speak to things that are obviously really important to the three of us, really important to the communities that we're a part of and the communities that I feel like we're hoping to serve. Like anything that we're doing, like when we speak to land back or when we speak to decolonizing, for me, those are verbs. Those are things that we actively need to be doing. And so my hope is that people who are interested, non-Native relatives who are interested in supporting Native folks, we'll, you know, like Britt said, be listening, let us be the authority on who we are and what we're hoping to achieve in a post-colonial world. And being an ally means that you're actively participating in a way that respects us as Indigenous peoples, and that you are respecting our right to Indigenous and tribal sovereignty.
Excellent. Britt, any other final thoughts?
Okay, thank you so much for having us be a part of this panel. Thank everyone for joining us, and thank you for doing all the background work to get this to be, because I know it's a lot of work. I guess my final remark would be is that, you know, just remember that Native people are here more than just in November, more than when there's Halloween and Thanksgiving and all that's happening. I would also say, make sure also, in addition to learning who's around you, learn what treaty you're under. The treaties that are here in the United States don't belong just to Native people. They belong to everybody who is on the land. And those are agreements and a binding contract between those of us who are from the tribes that are on those lands and those people that are there and the government that they're under. So definitely learn about that treaty. And also, like I said, go ahead and learn what issues the tribes around you are facing and find good ways that you can be in relation with those tribes and help to fight in a good way together, in a good way. Yakoke.
Thank you so much, all of you. This is really beautiful. And I just want to underscore something that I observed throughout, which I find particularly moving. And it's related to something else I want to make a comment on that, Amber, you offered us. Everybody introduced themselves with their language, which I find so powerful to hear the language of that's alive, right? Because again, our imagination often in the United States, or the thing that is perpetuated, is that these are not cultures that are alive. So I really want to acknowledge and thank you for sharing that with us, because I know how that is a part of you. I'm South African, and my second point was to something you said, Amber, which speaks so deeply to me, the idea of you know, indigenous culture and indigeneity being something that is global and something that a lot of us can relate to beyond Turtle Island, or maybe we can double down on that idea because of Turtle Island. Maybe that's a better way of thinking about it. So as an invitation to everybody on the call, I would love for you to think about everything that's been said, but then positioning it in where we are today. How do all of these issues play out, not just in faraway places as we imagine them, but right now? We think about boarding schools, and as Clevis very brilliantly brought up, that's happening right now. And guess what? Those Mexican relatives, they have more claim often to this land than the people who are chasing them down at the border, right? So there's so many rich things that we've been offered here. I hope you grapple with them. We'll definitely share our notes from the conversation, so you have more meat as we move forward beyond today. Tonight, we are welcoming Joy Harjo, who is an elder to all of us. I mean, if you are somebody who cares about the arts and cares about heart, like this thing over here, Joy Harjo is an elder and a living ancestor, and somebody we were so humbled to be with. And we look forward to welcoming you tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern to that conversation. Later on this weekend, we have a full roster of events. Saturday, we're going to explore food sovereignty with, again, somebody else who's been mentioned today, Kirsten. In the afternoon, we're going to actually spend time with some Pacific Island artists, which we're very excited about, because the United States played a huge role in the Pacific Islands, and there's Indigenous people in Hawaii and beyond who are definitely part of the conversation about Turtle Island. And on Sunday, we are welcoming Tommy Orange in the afternoon, and some amazing artists who will be with us to ground in true gratitude to our hosts the people who allow us to be here. But in the morning, before we do that, join Clevis and I. We are running a workshop that is an anti-racist workshop through an Indigenous lens. And we have a very beautiful, I mean, like, not just like my opinion beautiful, Vogue levels of beautiful. She's a model and she's an activist, and her name is Dawnette. So I hope you will join us throughout the week for some or all of these conversations. And it's back to work time now.